Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you for your patience. I'm Tanmay. Today I'm presenting my thesis proposal, as Jean said, and this is titled Learning and Translating Temporal Abstractions Across Humans and Robots. And this has been with my thesis committee, Jean, my advisor, Dave, Shubham, and Amy. So I want to start off by describing something that I think is quite remarkable. So on the right here, you have a human, an amateur cook, learning to cook a new dish by watching a professional chef cook this dish on YouTube. And humans are really good at this. Even amateur cooks can come up with incredible results by watching a YouTube video of a professional chef cook this dish. And we do so despite differences in the potential ingredients that we might be using, in the equipment that we're using, or potentially even in the kitchens that we are in. And what this example points to is how well humans are able to learn to solve tasks by watching demonstrations of other people solving these tasks. And in the cooking example, we aren't just good at solving tasks from demonstrations, we're also really good at doing this from instructions, from recipes, and from other diverse sources of information. And across learning from all of these different sources of information are two key abilities that enable humans to do so. The first is that humans are really good at reasoning over temporal abstractions of behaviors that they need to solve these tasks, as well as reasoning over the effects that these behaviors have on their environments. So as an example, let's consider a particular step in this recipe, maybe pouring oil into a pan. And here are two instances of pouring that you can consider. And humans are really good at pouring in a consistent manner over a period of time such that they get the desired effect, which is having the oil in the pan spread smoothly. And we don't really care about irrelevant details such as the angle at which we're pouring or the viscosity of the fluid or the size of the nozzle and so on. And the other thing we do is that we reason over this in a temporally abstract fashion. That is, I don't really care exactly what angle my bottle is at any given time step, as long as I'm doing this consistently over a period of time. That is, in a temporally abstract fashion. And the second ability that humans have that enables us to imitate demonstrators is the fact that we can understand tasks and the strategies used to solve these tasks in terms of these temporal abstractions. We can also find corresponding abstractions to execute for ourselves. So let's go back to this cooking example. If an amateur chef or an amateur cook is watching a professional chef cook a dish, they quickly recognize the recipe that the professional chef is following to cook this dish, even though they might not actually have the recipe written down. And once they recognize this recipe, we're usually pretty adept at executing each of these skills or each of the abstractions that I depicted here in blue. And this is an example of one such abstraction. And you can imagine there being a sequence of abstractions that you need to execute in the task. So we're really good at understanding these tasks in terms of these abstractions. And the other remarkable thing about this ability is that we do this irrespective of the modality that we're trying to learn from. We can do this whether we're learning from demonstrations, whether we're learning from instructions, from recipes, or other sources of information. And these two abilities together enable us to learn from demonstrations and from demonstrators in potentially different domains than our own. And we want to enable robots to be able to do this. In particular, in this thesis, we answer the question of how we can enable robots to acquire and reason about temporal abstractions of the tasks that they solve, as well as the behaviors that they need to solve these tasks. And you might ask the question, well, why do we need temporal abstractions? So let's consider you have a robot that's trying to cook you this dish instead of a human. One way you can get the robot to solve this task is maybe reason over the low-level joint controls or other controls that the robot needs to execute over the course of the entire trajectory. But this scales rather poorly with the length of the trajectory, and it gets increasingly tedious the longer the trajectory gets. And this also scales really poorly with number of tasks that you need to solve. So for example, if I needed to solve 10 or cook 10 dishes instead of cook one dish, then this gets increasingly more tedious and complex. Another way you can have the robot solve this task is to abstract away these low-level controls and abstract away the atomic timescale of this task, and instead reason over some abstractions of these behaviors. And these abstractions might be things like cutting the meat, adding oil to a pan, and putting the meat in a pan, and so forth. And what reasoning over these abstractions enables is the following three things. It enables us to generalize over task parameters. So it enables us to generalize over, say, positions of objects, or it also enables us to generalize over objects themselves. For example, if I wanted to swap this recipe for a vegetarian one, I could pretty easily replace the meat with the vegetable, and the skills that the robot needs to execute to cook this dish don't really change that much. These temporal abstractions also enable us to quickly learn to solve new tasks, because we can compose these temporal abstractions or skills to quickly solve new tasks without having to explore the space from scratch. And this also lends itself to combinatorial generalization, where being able to compose the skills that one has in new ways allows you a combinatorial increase in the abilities that a robot has, as opposed to if you were to just use these skills by themselves. And in the transfer setting, where you have a robot that's trying to learn to solve a task by watching a human solve this task, these temporal abstractions are also useful, because they offer you a shared perspective of the strategy that is needed to solve this task, and the skills and the effects on the environment that happen during the task. And they allow you to view these effects, skills, and task strategies from a shared perspective across different domains and across agents. So these temporal abstractions help transfer in a way that reasoning over the low-level atomic timescale doesn't. And now that we've seen why temporal abstractions are important, let's get into seeing what other work has been done in this space and where the work that we present sits with respect to them. And I'd like to think about this along three axes. The first axis is whether an approach reasons in terms of abstractions or whether it's a flat approach that reasons at an atomic timescale. And so anything that reasons in terms of temporal abstractions, I'm calling hierarchical. And so anything above this plane is a hierarchical approach, and anything below this plane is a flat approach. The second axis that you can consider is what data these approaches try to learn from. So you have reinforcement learning style approaches that try to learn from interaction data, interacting with their environment. And there's also approaches that try to learn from demonstration data, which comes under the category of imitation. Now, it's important to note that there are approaches that are neither of these, as in the case of handcrafted approaches that aren't really doing any learning. And there's also approaches that do both. And despite this ambiguity, this categorization is still useful to address some of the work that's been done in the robot learning community. And as before, anything to the left of this plane is a reinforcement learning approach. Anything to the right of it is an imitation learning approach. And the final axis that we consider is whether these approaches are instantiated in the context of a single domain, or whether they're trying to perform some kind of knowledge transfer across domains. That is their across-domain transfer approach. And as before, anything in front of this plane is cross-domain. Anything behind this plane is a single domain approach. Armed with this categorization of work, we can look at much of the work that's been done. So for example, traditional reinforcement learning methods fall into this back, bottom, left octant. And if you're trying to figure out which categories this belongs to, just look at the bold, red, underlined axis titles. So this includes things like the DPQ networks, PPO, many variants of these algorithms that have come out. And most of traditional imitation learning, such as behavior cloning, learning from demonstration, inverse RL, falls into this back, bottom, right octant. Now, I'm not going to exhaustively go over each of these octants right now, but what is important to know is that the work presented in our thesis occupies two of these octants. The first is this top right back octant, where we do hierarchical imitation learning in a single domain. And this is along with many other works that attempt problems in the space. And we present three works here, the first two of which are completed, the third of which is proposed. And this other part of the space that our work occupies is this front octant, which tries to do hierarchical imitation learning as before, but is also trying to transfer some knowledge across domains. And if you look at the work that's out there in this, it doesn't seem like there is actually any work that does hierarchical imitation learning that tries to transfer across domains. And this is particularly surprising given how useful the concept of applying hierarchy is to transfer. And so we present two works that occupy this space. The first of which is completed work, the second of which is proposed work, that to the best of our knowledge are the first works to try to address problems in the space. And armed with that understanding, let's move to part one, which deals with acquiring and representing agent behaviors. The specific project that we're going to present is called Learning Robot Skills with Temporal Variational Inference. It was published at ICML 2020 and serves as a backbone for much of the work that we are presenting in this thesis. If we quickly go back to the abilities that we talked about before, this part of the talk focuses on the first half of ability one. How can robots acquire temporal abstractions of behaviors that they need to solve tasks? And for now, we're not really going to pay attention to learning the effects of these behaviors. The specific question that we want to answer is how can robots acquire and represent temporal abstractions of behaviors that they execute? And there have been other works that try to address this problem. There have been handcrafted approaches that, such as the options framework, or a lot of the work that's been done on learning skills in the table tennis domain. But these are typically, they need a lot of engineering to get them to work, and they're also limited to a very restricted problem setting once they're designed. There have also been approaches that try to learn such abstractions. So this category of work here tries to learn abstractions or skills from interacting with the environment. One of the issues with this kind of work is that it's limited to the space of skills that it can explore during interacting with the environment, which is somewhat limited. In contrast, there's also been work that tries to learn skills or learn abstractions from demonstrations. So here there's some work that learns a discrete set of skills from demonstrations. And learning from demonstrations is nice in this context because it enables you to explore parts of the space that are actually useful because the demonstrations are naturally in that space. But on the downside, most of these approaches require you to pre-specify a number of skills that you're going to learn. And this needs a certain amount of domain knowledge to be able to execute. And finally, there's also work that tries to learn a continuous space of abstractions or skills rather than learning a discrete set of them, also from demonstrations. And what learning a continuous space of these skills lets you do is learn a potentially infinite number of skills, and it doesn't really need you to specify how many skills you want to learn. And we have two works in this space, and we're going to focus on one of them for the purpose of this talk. So how do we go about building such abstractions? Well, we're going to consider the problem setting where we have access to demonstration data of a robot performing a bunch of different tasks. And we're also going to assume that this demonstration data is unlabeled and unsegmented. We're not going to assume access to supervision over the number of skills that we are learning, the temporal segmentations of them, or the semantic categories that they belong to. We're going to try to come up with some skill representation learning technique that gives us a space of skills as depicted on the right. And to do so, I'm going to first describe the options framework. So let's consider a trajectory. And this might just be a sequence of states and actions. And let's consider this trajectory has three parts. The first of which might be something like reaching a bottle, the second of which might be grasping a bottle, and third of which might be just lifting a bottle. Now we can represent each part of this trajectory with an option, where an option is a temporally extended period of time during which the agent is behaving in a consistent manner towards some goal or objective. And we assume that these options are parameterized by two variables. They're parameterized by a policy that specifies how the agent should act while it's executing this option, as well as a termination condition or termination variable that specifies when the agent needs to stop executing that option and move on to a new option. And there's also a notion of a high-level policy that comes along with these options. And this high-level policy specifies what option the agent needs to execute. And this high-level policy looks something like this. It takes in a state input, as well as some kind of task specification, and spits out a choice of option. And this choice of option might be a categorical variable or a one-hot vector over the set of options that you have. Or in our case, it's a continuous value vector that represents the option that you want to execute. And this choice of option is then fed into a low-level policy along with the current state of the world. And this low-level policy tells the agent what low-level action it needs to execute at the next time step. Now, we can also represent these options as latent variables. In particular, we represent each of these options with its own latent variable zeta. And zeta contains 2 bits of information: what option I should be executing at, and when I should stop executing this option and move on to a new option. And now that we've represented these options, let's talk about how we can infer them. Well, we have a trajectory, and if you remember from before, we assumed access to demonstration data. So this trajectory is an observed variable, depicted in gray. And we also have some unobserved variables, the latent options, depicted in white. And you can pick your favorite inference algorithm to go from the observed variable to the unobserved variables. We go to variational inference. The variational inference typically uses an encoder Q to predict the inferred latents from the observed trajectory. Now, standard variational inference does this by trying to maximize the true likelihood of the observed data by maximizing a lower bound to this that depends on the inferred latents. And the inferred latents are essentially just sampled from the variational encoder. And it does this by decomposing this joint likelihood of the trajectory and the latents into 2 components: a conditional of the trajectory given the latents, and a prior over the latents. Now, it turns out that this conditional, in our case, is not particularly useful. It doesn't tell us how to act because it's not a policy, it's just a likelihood. And moreover, it's also difficult to estimate because it's the likelihood of an entire sequence given another entire sequence. So instead, we decide not to use this decomposition of this joint probability. We use a different decomposition of this joint probability into the following 3 terms. The first of these terms specifies the likelihood of the inferred option under the current estimate of the high-level policy, eta. The second term tells you the likelihood of the observed action under the current estimate of the low-level policy. And the third term are the system dynamics. Now, you can see how the right-hand side of this equation forms a different objective than the standard variational inference objective. And it turns out that the system dynamics don't actually matter here, but what this does is it gives you an objective that directly gives you the high-level and low-level policies for you to optimize the right-hand side of this objective with respect to the high-level and low-level policies. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm confused. So if we go to the previous one, which you said is not very useful, I thought the expansion of this would be precisely the expansion of the summation of these two. If you're modeling P psi as a high-level policy, would be exactly what you show in next slide.
No, this doesn't model the likelihood of the option given the high-level policy, right? Because I mean, you can convert from one to the other, okay, via this joint, but I think this itself doesn't include likelihood of the option under the high-level policy because it's conditioned on it.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. So this objective does give you estimates of the low-level and high-level policy for you to optimize it. Yep.
Sorry, I just want to make sure I understand. What's the dot supposed to be? What are you conditioning on?
Oh, we actually condition on, so this guy gets the current state, the current action, and history of actions and options. So I'm happy to write this offline as well, but this receives states from 1 to t, actions from 1 to t minus 1, and options from 1 to t minus 1. This policy receives states from 1 to t, actions from 1 to t minus 1, and options from 1 to t, because you're assuming that this is observed when you estimate this likelihood. And yeah, the dynamics in general can be conditional on anything in the past.
And that sum is equivalent to log the joint?
Yeah. Okay. Well, there's 2 details there. One, you need to assume an initial state distribution for that I left out of this. And the other is that you have to, this implicitly contains a product over time steps, which becomes the summation. So you need to consider this for every time step you take. Okay. And the other thing to note about this objective is that it is unsupervised. It doesn't need labels of what semantic categories the options that you're trying to learn are from, how many options there are. In practice, we do end up using a prior over how long these trajectories should be, but this is not the same as explicit supervision as of how long these options need to be. So how well does optimizing this end up working in practice? We evaluate this on a series of data sets that are across 4 different robots with several different tasks and varying number of demonstrations. Yeah.
One question for the last thing.
Yeah.
If you don't have like any priors, as you said, right,
yeah,
this is completely unsupervised. Why cannot it learn just a high-level policy? Why does it have to be anything semantic? That's useful. An option, right?
If you don't have any priors, what often happens in learning is the system either learns to represent the entire trajectory as one latent variable, or it represents every time step as one latent variable.
Yes, why wouldn't that happen? Don't you need like any regularization for that to not happen?
Yeah, so we have a prior over the length of the option that we execute that does that, yeah. Right, so we learn a space of options over each of these data sets. And we can take a look at some of the skills that we learned from these data sets here. And these are just a sample of a few skills, and I'll show you the entire space of skills in a second. But you can see here that there's a backstairs motion that looks like a lifting skill. Here it's twisting its wrist. On the Robotech data set, I'm not sure how visible this is, but you can see the robot closing its gripper. Here it's doing it's sliding an imaginary object forward. And here a Franca robot is reaching towards the far side of its table and placing a different object at the bottom. And we can also learn skills over human characters. So here there's a human reaching towards an object and pushing another one. And as I said, these are only a few of the skills that we learned. You can visualize the entire space of skills that the model learns by embedding this into 2 dimensions with something like TSNE. And what you'll see here are there are different clusters of skills that emerge that correspond quite well with traditional notions of skills in the manipulation community. So things like there's grasping skills or pushing skills, or reaching and placing skills. And in case of the human data set, there's a broader variety of skills that and exciting things like running and ducking and performing front flips and playing basketball and so forth. And these are just some of the results. I'm happy to go into more results offline. But essentially, this part of the talk was seeing how we can enable robots to build and reason over temporal abstractions of behaviors that they need to solve tasks. And we did this from demonstrations in an unsupervised manner. And I'm going to pause here and ask if there are any other questions. Okay, great. Let's move on to part 2 of the talk. And this deals with how we can translate some of the skills that we just learned across humans and across different robots. And just as a reminder, this work now occupies this front part of the space where we're doing hierarchical imitation learning as before, but now we're trying to transfer some knowledge across different domains. The specific project we're presenting is called Translating Robot Skills, or Learning Unsupervised Skill Correspondences Across Domains. And this was published at ICML 2022. Now, if we go back to these 2 abilities from before, we saw in part 1 how we can address the first half of ability 1. In this part of the talk, we shift focus to ability 2, which is how we can enable robots to understand the high-level strategies of tasks in terms of temporal abstractions that they already have, and find corresponding abstractions to execute for themselves. And just to give you an example of what this might look like, in the example where there's a robot learning to cook from a professional chef, it might recognize that the chef is executing this sequence of abstractions. And once it has done this, it's trying to then pick up or trying to execute corresponding skills for itself. And this part of the talk tries to answer this question of how the robot can learn correspondences between its own skills and those of a demonstrator, whether that demonstrator is a human or a robot with a different embodiment. And ideally, we want to do this in an unsupervised way, because having supervision over correspondences between skills across the agents is very tedious and would need to be annotated for each pair of learner and demonstrator that you have. So we're going to consider the same problem setting where you have unlabeled demonstration data and some skill representation learning technique that gives you a space of skills. Here, this is essentially just the temporal variational inference that we showed you from before. And what we're also going to assume is that we have access to this data and this representation in two domains: a source domain that corresponds to the demonstrator, and a target domain that corresponds to the learner robot. And we're also going to assume that there's some overlap in the tasks that each of these demonstration data sets solve. But this is not a complete overlap. That is, there are tasks in the source demonstration data set that are not observed in the target data set. And it's transferring these demonstrations where our approach is most useful. And we're also going to assume that there's no parallel data between these demonstrations. So we don't have any parallel data in terms of them both being annotated with the same tasks. We're just going to assume that there's two independently collected data sets. What we want to learn are these correspondences between these two skill spaces, depicted by these red lines here. And an example of such a correspondence might look something like this. Say this skill in the human skill space, which might look like a human reaching towards an object, ought to correspond with this skill in the target skill space, which corresponds to a robot reaching towards an object. So how do we go about learning such correspondences? Well, we can begin by first representing these correspondences as a learned mapping function f. Now, if you look at this problem, there's no parallel data, but there is independently collected demonstration data in each domain. There's a learned representation in each domain that we're trying to learn a mapping function across. Now, this is actually very reminiscent of the unsupervised machine translation problem, where you have access to text in different languages, but no parallel text between these two languages. And you have a learned representation in each language, such as a word-to-vec embedding or a sentence embedding, that you're trying to learn a translation function across. And this similarity between the unsupervised machine translation problem and our own problem allows us to use much of the machinery that they use for our own problem. In particular, we use this idea of learning a translation model that translates the source domain skill space to a translated space. Now what we want to do is constrain this translated space to the target space in such a way that this translation model captures meaningful correspondences. And how do we do that? Well, we make the insight that agents with different embodiments use similar sequences of skills to execute similar tasks. So for example, whether I told a human or a robot to pour me some water, both of them would follow the broad strategy of reaching towards this bottle, grasping it, lifting it, pouring from it, etc. And we can operationalize this insight by saying that sequences of skills should come from similar distributions, irrespective of the morphology of the agent executing them. And that looks something like this. We can perform some sort of distribution estimation to get estimates of the distribution of sequences of skills in both the translated space and the target space. And then we can train our translation model to match these two distributions. And for this, you can pick your favorite divergence metric between these two distributions and then minimize it with respect to the translation model. So how well does this end up working in practice? It actually works quite well. In this example, we're showing you a placing skill executed by a human that's translated to 4 other agents. So here, it's translated to a bachelor's left and right hands on the top 2 rows, and the time progresses from left to right. And it's translated to a Sawyer here and a Franca robot here. And what you'll notice about this is there is some good correspondence between what the human executes and what the Sawyer executes, what the Franca executes, and the Baxter's, both of the Baxter's hands. And to make this visualization a bit easier for you to see, in the top row, you're seeing just individual skills on a human character translated to a Baxter robot, the right hand of a Baxter robot on the bottom. So, and you can see that there's good coarse correspondences between these skills. For example, reaching skills are translated to reaching skills and so forth. But one thing you should note here is that the approach didn't have these labels of what semantic category these skills belong to. It just had the trajectories and a latent representation of them. You can also translate entire trajectories. So this trajectory of a human performing the stamping motion is translated to a Franca robot in this case, which is trying to perform a similar to and fro motion. And this part of the talk was moving towards how we can enable robots with an ability to understand task strategies in terms of abstractions, and then find corresponding abstractions to execute for themselves. And we've also been exploring how we can extend this to dexterous manipulation skills in addition to skills of robot and human arms. And this is what
Can I actually interrupt for a second? I just have a question about the previous project. So in the example that you have here, right, like we do have this like vertical symmetry. So what is actually preventing a translation from left hand on the human side to right hand on the robot side?
Yeah, that's a good point. So here we are pretending that the Baxter's left and right hands are different agents. So it's not remarkable that the right hand's motion is translated to the right hand on the Baxter. It's in this example, only the right hand is moving. In the top row, only the left hand is moving. Yeah, so we haven't like done anything to prevent transfer. Like if you were to try to transfer from both of the human's hands to both of the Baxter's hands, there's nothing that prevents you from learning correspondences across hands. Does that make sense?
So there's an implicit assumption maybe that the distribution over left-handed versus right-handed motions is not the same, or if it was the same, then that kind of translation could happen.
The distribution over left-handedness and right-handedness are not the same. Yeah, the transition could definitely still happen. Like I think like I said, if you were to model both human hands and both robot hands together, there's no like constraints that we place on how many skills should belong to the left hand versus the right hand. I think we modeled them as independent hands because we were also trying to transfer to robots with only a single hand. And it was very unclear how you do that with both left hand and the right hand moving at the same time and trying to translate that to a single robot arm. Yeah. I think you could place fairly simple constraints on handedness if you were to trying to translate to robots with two arms. And like I think that's not adding. It's a small assumption, but it's not a super restrictive assumption, I think. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Yep.
Can I ask a quick question? Perhaps I'm missing something in the motivation. So when I think of translation or transfer learning, so I would imagine that in this setting, do you have like equal number or an amount of data from both the source and the target domain? Because I would imagine one motivation of learning this transfer function would be, or this translation function would be that, you know what, if I did not have enough data in the target domain, maybe having some analog of one-shot or zero-shot transfer. So is that the motivation?
Yeah, I think this like problem aims at particularly the setting where you have certain source domain demonstrations that you don't have in the target domain, but you have enough demonstrations in the target domain that you can learn an alignment such that you can transfer the demonstrations that you don't have in the target domain to the target robot. And that sort of enables the target robot to adopt the same strategy that the source domain agent used to solve the task. Yeah, but we haven't, like, so that's what I said when we assumed that there was partial overlap in the tasks that they solved. So there's the overlap is what gives you signal for learning, and the set of tasks outside the overlap are what you can effectively transfer across. Okay. And I just want to quickly mention that we're also extending this to robot and human hands, where we are replacing this with dexterous human manipulation data that consists of a human hand manipulating several objects and a dexterous robot hand performing some dexterous manipulation skills. And we're trying to see if a similar approach can learn meaningful correspondences across both a human and a robot hand. With that, I'm going to move to part 3 of the talk. I'm going to pause here and ask if there are any other questions. Okay, great. So far, part 3 of the talk deals with how we can learn and represent the effects of skills that agents execute. And this is partially ongoing and is proposed work as well. And the project that we're presenting is titled Learning Abstract Representations of Agent-Environment Interactions. And this has been accepted at the Coral 2022 workshop. Now, if we go back to these two abilities, we've seen how we can address the first half of ability 1. But we left out this notion of the effects that behaviors that agents execute have on their environments. And in this part of the talk, we focus on extending these temporal abstractions to also model their effects on the environment. So just going back to this example of a robot learning from a human, we kept track of things like skills that each agent would execute. So maybe there are skills like chopping the meat, pouring, placing meat into a pan, and so forth. And we've seen how we can learn behavioral abstractions of each of these skills. But in addition to these skills, there's also a notion of effects that these skills have on their environment. So this includes things like chopping meat means that the meat gets cut, pouring oil into a pan has the effect of oil being added to the pan, and so forth. And just as we learned these behavioral abstractions, we can also learn environmental abstractions that model the patterns of change the environment undergoes during a task. And you can also imagine combining both these behavioral abstractions with these environmental abstractions to build interaction abstractions that model both the skill that an agent executes as well as the effect that it has in the environment. And in this part of the talk, we'd like to answer the question of how can we enable robots to acquire and reason over temporal abstractions of patterns of change that occur during a task in the environment, as well as the effect, the skills that we use to affect these changes. And just as a reminder, this enables us to view the effects that skills have from a shared perspective across different domains and across agents. And it also will facilitate us transferring task strategies across agents and domains. And we're going to take a look at that later down the line. Now, in general, this problem of learning representations of the effects that skills have is a very broad problem. So we're going to restrict this and scope it down a little bit. We're going to assume that environments are simply single objects in a tabletop setting, and that the state of these objects is known and represented by their 6D position and orientation. And you can consider later relaxing this to multiple objects, to different state representations, and potentially articulated objects and so forth. But for now, we're going to stick with a single tabletop rigid object. We're also going to assume that there's an agent that's interacting with these objects, and that the agent is either a human or a robot. Now, these assumptions are somewhat restrictive, but they're not entirely uncommon. So there are cases such as pouring from a kettle into a cup or screwing in a light bulb, where there's an agent interacting with a single object, and the object is undergoing some interesting pattern of motion, such as this pouring, where you're tilting the object, or the screwing in of a light bulb. And it would be interesting and useful to model these patterns of motion that the objects undergo. Now, there have been a lot of other works that do this. And to go over a subset of them, there's works that build temporal abstractions of environmental state from observations, but these typically don't have a notion of the agent that caused these changes. There's also been work on, which is some of Amy's work that models changes in the environmental state and the agent's action that affected these changes. But these works typically model changes of state as a snapshot at the start and the end of the behavior and don't really model the pattern of change that that the environment undergoes over the course of a trajectory. And there's also work, including our own work, that tries to model temporal abstractions of agent action. And what we'd really like is to be in this intersection of these three circles, where we're modeling both agent action, the patterns of change that occur in the environment, as well as the interactions between these two. And that's where this current project is aimed to be. So we're going to assume the same problem setting as before, but now we're also going to assume access to object state information in addition to just robot state information. And we're going to assume that we're trying to come up with some abstraction representation learning technique that gives us a space of the interactions observed in these demonstrations. So how do we go about building these environment-aware abstractions? Well, we could build temporal abstractions over the environment itself. And one way we can do this is to reuse the temporal variational inference architecture that we saw before. So let's take a look at that architecture. In TVI, we took a robot trajectory, we encoded it via some encoder into a behavior abstraction that we then decoded via a policy into back into the original trajectory. Now you can imagine applying the exact same thing to environment trajectories instead. So here there's a trajectory that the object in the environment undergoes during a task that you encode into an environment abstraction. And just as before, you can decode this via some decoder into the original trajectory that you observed. And these environment abstractions correspond to the effects that we saw from before. So they're trying to model the patterns of change that an object undergoes during the execution of a task. And you can also imagine combining these environment abstractions with the skills that we learned in part 1 of the talk to build interaction abstractions. And that looks something like this. We consider a joint architecture where you encode both the robot and the environment trajectory together into an interaction abstraction. And this is via a single encoder. And you can imagine decoding the joint trajectory that the robot and the environment undergo from this interaction abstraction via some policy pipe. And you can also imagine factoring this architecture into two different streams, where one stream corresponds to the robot or the behavioral stream, and the other stream corresponds to an environment stream, where you're encoding the environment trajectory into an environment abstraction. And then you can combine or fuse these abstractions into an interaction abstraction, either by concatenating these abstractions or adding them or some other fusion. And as before, you can imagine reconstructing the original trajectory from this interaction abstraction.
Hey, Tanmay, quick question. Yep. So I thought that robot states and environmental states would be part of that trajectory. So why does the decoder take those as input?
So the decoder, the decoder takes in the current robot and environment state. So you can sort of decode or roll out your policy from various different states, right? Mm-hmm. So the abstraction is sort of encoding the pattern of behavior that you want to see, but it's not encoding the actual trajectory itself. It's meant to be a conditioning variable that the policy uses. Does that make sense?
Yeah, just it seems like if the joint trajectory contains environmental states, then it could just learn a trivial, like, so if you could imagine a version of this where you are reconstructing the states themselves, and then in that case you don't really need to feed in this guy here. Feeding in this means you can maybe add some ability to modulate your policy or change the starting state of where you roll out the policy from. But in our case, what we're doing is we're actually reconstructing the delta state changes, or you can imagine like reconstructing actions observed in a trajectory, in which case you also do need to feed in this initial states that the policy is run from.
So another question. This is Chris Ax.
Yep.
As far as I can tell, everything up to now has involved robots waving their arms, but not really actually doing anything. In this case, is there any verification of the physics? Is there constraint, for example, that the joint trajectory, the robot's actually touching an object it's manipulating?
Not explicitly, no. Though, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So this would work fine for computer graphics and playing stuff back, but unlikely to mean much for real robots manipulating real objects.
I think I agree that the works that we've presented, particularly in part 2, are more useful for scenarios where you're not interacting with an object, and that including object information was one of the key things that we needed to add to this for it to be able to work on a robot. I'm still fairly optimistic that this would be useful in the robot case. I agree that it doesn't model physics, but I think a lot of the robot learning approaches I see don't explicitly model physics, but use interaction or demonstration data to implicitly do that.
Okay.
Does that answer your question, Chris?
I'm very skeptical, but I understand what you're doing.
I mean, okay. we can have a longer discussion after the next one.
Okay. Yeah, and just to remind you, these interaction abstractions are trying to model both the skill as well as the change in the patterns of environmental change that you see. And just to give you a quick peek into how these interaction abstractions will be used, you can imagine doing something like this, where you learn interaction abstractions in the source domain on the human side for some set of tasks, and you learn similar interaction abstractions on the target domain for a different set or slightly different set of tasks. And you learn a translation model across these two domains. And we're not going to get into this in a lot of detail right now. We'll see it in the later part of the talk. But this is how we imagine the interaction abstractions being used. So how will this learning these abstract representations of the environment and interactions between the agent and the environment actually work? Well, we did some preliminary experiments on this to evaluate this, where we learned interaction and environment abstractions independently from one another. And we did this on 2 small data sets, the RoboTurk and RoboMimic data sets, where we consider the instances of tasks. We consider one of the objects in each of these tasks, and they're on a Sawyer and Franca robot respectively. And these are some samples of the interactions that we're able to model. So on the top row, you're seeing ground truth trajectories of a robot interacting. So this is the robot placing a block on a little peg, and this is the robot moving a milk carton to the bin on the right. And what you're seeing on the bottom row are reconstructions of these trajectories via a learned interaction abstraction. These particular interaction abstractions were learned with our factored architecture. And what you see here are that there's correspondence, a meaningful correspondence between the skill that the robot is executing and the effect that it has on the object in the reconstruction here. And this is true for both sets of tasks. And this is also true when we ran this on the similar instances of tasks on the RoboMimic dataset, on a Franca robot, where you can see that the robot's sort of executing this placing skill of the block over a peg, and also placing the milk carton in a bin. I'll give you a second to take a look at this. So what does this really mean? Well, there are 2 things that you can get from this. One, you'll note how there are these free pairs of skills and effects that you effectively have access to from this. And I want you to just remember that and keep it to later. The other thing to note is that you can imagine how viewing the interactions of similar tasks across these two different robots in two different domains through the lens of these interaction abstractions could lend a shared perspective of both of them. And we're going to exploit that later on as well. And just as a reminder, these meaningful correspondences were tested out over a small set of interactions. And you can also visualize the other set of interactions that was observed in the data sets in a very similar visualization to what we had before. And this is a space of all of the interactions observed across all the data sets. So here, there's many different clusters of interactions that emerge. So some of these interactions are just the robot acting on its own, and the object isn't really being manipulated. So there's things like reaching skills here towards the object and so forth. There's also skills where the robot is making or breaking contact with the object. So over here, it's releasing the object from its hand. There's a grasping, the robot's grasping a block as well. And there's also clusters where the object is in the robot's hand and it's moving it around. So things like placing the object in a different part of the workspace, or moving it up or down, or placing the block on the peg. And so this shows some amount of promise that our approach is able to model interactions between the agent and an object in its environment. But we'd also like to see how well this does on a broader set of objects. In particular, we propose the following 3 experiments to explore this. The first is experimenting on more diverse data and seeing whether we can represent broader sets of tasks, interactions, and objects. And we want to evaluate this first on several robot data sets, such as the SEICAN and the PERACT data set pictured here, where there's much more obvious diversity in the objects, tasks, and interactions that you observe. And we'd also like to evaluate this on other human data sets, where there's humans interacting with objects. And this includes the GRAB and the MMM dataset, where there's a human interacting with different objects. And we'd like to see whether we can also model these interactions as well. And the second experiment that we propose is extending this to multiple objects. So one of the biggest restrictions that our approach assumed so far was that we were operating in the case of a single object. We'd also like to see whether we can extend this to modeling interactions between multiple objects. So we propose experimenting with a fixed number of objects to begin with, such as 2 or 3 objects, and then scaling this up to, and then scaling this up to more objects. And this might need exploring a different state representation that's able to handle multiple objects. And one of the challenges that comes up here is, as you scale up to more and more objects, there's going to be a combinatorial explosion in the possibility of states that you observe. And we need to figure out a way to do that. And the third experiment that we propose is learning abstract forward and inverse dynamics models. And in particular, you remember that we mentioned that there were 3 pairs of skills and effects that you could gain from learning interaction abstractions. And we'd like to use those 3 pairs of skills and effects to see whether we can learn abstract forward models of that take in an input behavior and predict the effect that it has on the environment in a temporally abstract way in terms of this abstraction here. And we actually can supervise the training of this because we have the true environment abstraction that was observed in the data set. And just as we learn these abstract forward models, we'd also like to see whether we can learn abstract inverse models, where you take in the predicted, the desired environment abstraction that you'd like to observe, and predict the skill that or behavior that leads to this desired effect. And as before, you can supervise the training of this using the true behavioral abstraction observed in the data set. And I'll show you how we use these inverse models later on. So this part of the talk was trying to address how we can extend the temporal abstractions from before to also reason about the effects that skills had on their environments. Let's move on to part 4, which is our final proposed work. And this is titled Translating Environment-Aware Task Strategies across Humans and Robots. And so if we go back to these abilities, we've seen how we can address ability 1 in parts 1 and 3 of the talk. And in part 2, when we visited ability 2, we hadn't really looked at abstractions that model the effects of behaviors. So we'd like to revisit ability 2 now that we have abstractions that do also model the effects that behaviors have on their environment. And I alluded to this before, but we're going to look at this problem of translating environment-aware abstractions, where we learn a set of interaction abstractions in a source domain, as well as in a target domain, and we're going to try to translate across them. And this, as I said before, enables a shared perspective of the skills and the effects across domains and across agents. And it also allows the learner to adopt the strategy the demonstrator used for itself. And we propose exploring several different ways to do this. So there's several questions that we need to answer here in terms of how we approach this. In particular, what abstractions do we try to translate? Do we try to translate the environmental abstractions themselves, or do we translate the interaction abstractions? Second, how do we actually go about doing this translation? And third, how do we use the resulting translations? Let's look at question 1. We can either translate the environment abstractions themselves, or we can translate interaction abstractions. If we wanted to translate the environment abstractions, it would look something like this. You learn environment abstractions in the source domain, as well as in the target domain, and then learn a translation function between just their effects. Pictorially, this we can represent as something like this, where you have demonstration data in each domain, and you have an environmental abstraction learning technique in each domain. And this gives you a space of the learned environment abstractions in the source and target domains that you're trying to learn translation across. And as before, we're going to assume that we're going to do this with some partial overlap in the tasks that these demonstration datasets have. We can also consider translating the interaction abstractions rather than the environment abstractions. So here, you consider the interaction abstractions learned in a source domain and slightly different interaction abstractions in the target domain and translating across them. And this looks the exact same as the translating environment abstractions, except now you have a space of interaction abstractions here. And the second question is how we can actually go about addressing this translation. Well, in part 2 of the talk, we saw how we could do this by sequence matching. In particular, we said that we have, you could imagine something like taking the learned abstractions spaces, estimating the sequence of the distributions that occur in the source and target, and then training a translation model to match these sequences as before. And we expect this to work about as well as it did before. But this doesn't really exploit any of the additional information that we have in this problem setting, which is the effects that these behaviors have on their environment. So how can we exploit that knowledge of effect on environment? Well, we can say that if you have environment-aware abstractions in the source and target domain, maybe I can translate them from the source domain to the target domain and look at 2 environment abstractions in both domains, decode them into their respective effects in the target domain, and then train a translation model to predict an environmental abstraction such that the difference between these effects is minimized. So essentially what this is saying is that the translation model is trying to learn representations of environmental abstractions such that they have similar effects on the environment. And if you need a minute to digest this, I'm happy to spend a second. Any questions on this? Okay, cool. You can also do other things like domain adversarial training, where you train a translation model to try to fool a discriminator that's distinguishing between samples from both of these domains. And you can train something like a cycle GAN approach, which adds a cycle consistency loss to this. And this, the cycle consistency loss essentially enforces that a translation from the source domain to the target and back ought to be identical to the original input. This is great, but how do we actually use any of these translations? Well, it depends on whether we're translating the environment abstractions or the interaction abstractions. If we're translating the environment abstractions, we can take a demonstration in the source domain that doesn't really exist in the target domain, encode it into its environment abstraction, translate this environment abstraction to the target domain, and then finally use our inverse model from before to predict the behavior that leads to this effect, and then decode this behavior into a trajectory that the robot can execute. If we want to use interaction abstractions, we can do something similar. We can take our demonstration, encode it into an interaction abstraction, translate this interaction abstraction to the target domain, and then directly decode this via a policy using our interaction abstraction. And this is because the interaction abstraction also contains information of the skill itself and not just the effect that it has on the environment. And we propose a few experiments to evaluate this. We want to use some of the similar data sets as before. And we'd also like to evaluate how well we can transfer across each pair of these data sets. In particular, if we can transfer from the grab to each of these 3 robot data sets and the MMM data set to each of these 3 robot data sets. And we'd also like to evaluate on several different, this is a picture of the grab data set as before. We'd also like to evaluate on the following robot environments, where there's the per act environments depicted here, the RoboSuite environments as we'd shown earlier in the talk, and these simulated adroit hand environments where you're performing dexterous skills. And ideally, if these environments are, the results on these environments are promising, we'd also like to see whether we can replicate these results on a real Sawyer or a Franklin. And the primary experiment that I'm proposing here is to measure how successfully we can transfer across different combinations of data in agents. That is, we can measure something like task success or task reward on a matrix of source data sets and target data sets or target agents. And ideally, we'd like to do this for different combinations of the approaches that we talked about. And with that, I'd like to say that hopefully these works bring us closer towards answering these 2 questions or enabling robots with these 2 abilities, and eventually enabling robots to quickly learn from demonstrations or demonstrators in different domains. I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about potential future work that these works enable. In particular, whether they can enable translating across more abstract representations. Sorry, was there a question on Zoom?
Yeah.
Okay. Throughout most of the talk, we've seen translation from these skilled representations learned from demonstration data. In general, I think it would also be interesting to explore whether we can do things based on interaction data trained from rather than demonstration data, because this would allow us to extend this translation to approaches that don't have demonstration data on the target domain. And more generally speaking, I think this perspective of translation across abstract representations could be useful or could be interesting in exploring translating from instructions or natural language to learned skill representations or learn from demonstration data. And with that, I'd like to go over the timeline I have for my proposed work. So we're currently over here at my proposal, with prior work having been completed. I'd like to spend the rest of the spring semester in 2023 continuing to work on the project on learning abstract representations of interactions, at which point I'd like to submit this to a late spring conference and then transition to working on translating environment-aware strategies across humans and robots. I'd like to submit this work to a late fall conference and then begin writing my thesis document and eventually defending sometime between November 2023 and Feb 2024, and finally graduating in May 2024. And with that, I'd like to thank all of the people involved in this thesis proposal, Jean, who has been amazing throughout my PhD and incredibly supportive, my thesis committee members for being here and for giving me feedback over the past few months, and be patient with me. My collaborators at CMU, at FAIR, the Big Lab, who've listened to multiple editions of this talk, and my friends in Pittsburgh, whom I've bugged incessantly for feedback. And with that, thank you. And if there are any questions, please let me know.
Thanks for the great presentation. So we'll start with the committee first. So from the external committee first. So Amy, why don't you start first?
Sorry, I'm not actually very familiar with like how the format of this is supposed to go. Do you mind explaining to me what?
Oh yeah, if you had any questions, go first, or would you like to go?
So basically, we sort of each the committee members ask like kind of questions, and then we later will kind of kick out Tanmay and just discuss among the committee.
Cool. Yeah. So I actually just have a clarifying question for now. So there was like a portion of your talk where you were talking about disentangling between the environment and environment and robot abstraction. Yep. Can you talk a little bit more about that and like how you would actually define the environment versus robot? Because I think that can be a very philosophical question, according to Rich Sutton.
That's, yeah, let me pull up this. If I'm correct, you're referring to this guy? Yeah, so yeah. I think, yeah. The discussion in the context of this slide was mostly architectural in looking at whether a factored approach would be more suitable to downstream transfer if you swapped out a robot. Yeah, and ideally, I think factoring this into an environment stream and an agent stream allows you to sort of swap out this agent stream for a different agent more easily than the joint approach does. More philosophically, I think I would refer to, so we talked about a recent paper from Peter Stone's group and Zhu's group in UT Austin that worked on factoring states into agent state, controllable states, and irrelevant states or uncontrollable states. And I think that discussion is relevant here in that the agent is something that you can control directly. And we're going to consider parts of the environment that we can control indirectly as environment states. And I think in the scope of my research, I'm sort of ignoring anything that I can't control, even indirectly. Does that make sense?
Yes. But I like a more explicit definition or assumption that you're relying on that allows you to distinguish what is the robot state versus the environment state.
Okay, so I'm mostly going to be dealing, or I plan to deal with robot state being, say, joint angles or end effector state, which to me, there's a fairly it's clear that how these states differ from states of objects in the environment. I can imagine the distinction being a problem if you're trying to learn from, say, visual inputs and you're not sure what parts of your image are the robot versus the environment. Yeah, does that answer your question? Would you?
Yes, yes. Okay. Yeah, that is much more clear. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Amy, do you have any other questions?
That's it for now.
Okay, feel free to jump in if you have other questions. And then maybe Shibani.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, very nice and polished talk, by the way.
Thank you.
So I think I have a lot of questions, but I'll prioritize maybe. Okay. So in sort of part 3 of the talk, at the end, you were showing some of these reconstructions, right? Yeah. By joint modeling here.
Yeah. Yeah. These ones?
Yeah, sorry. So, but I would sort of contrast this with what you are learning basically a probabilistic model of these interactions that you have seen, right? And in vision community, if someone learns the probabilistic model over images, they never show reconstructions, right? They show new samples that you can generate that, okay, given this environment, these are the interactions that I imagine. So I think that would be much more compelling because, you know, if there's more information leaking in the variation bottleneck, you'll get perfect reconstructions, but reviews less samplings.
I see. Okay.
So that's maybe one suggestion, which is you should try highlighting that. Not some of it. And some of the other questions, I guess for the next part, when we go to sort of translating this model, you were talking about these two variants, right? So one where the translation is based on the object, object state. And I guess the question I have is perhaps relevant to both, but we can focus on the object state, right? So the translation model works as follows. It sees the change in one environment and then predicts what that corresponds to as a change in the other environment or in the other domain. But doesn't this sort of assume that in your second domain, you have almost a fixed object, right? Because if you see me pick a bottle and you want to understand how that corresponds to change of an object in robot domain, aren't you assuming that there is the specific bottle that exists in the robot domain because the translation model doesn't see the robot domain, right? It only sees the agent domain and just predicts directly a change. So I'm not sure this will let you handle, like, this seems to me a very restricting assumption on how much object variation because sort of the translation without looking at domain 2 and without looking at the object in domain 2 is supposed to predict the change of that unknown object.
Right, I see. Okay, so I agree that like it doesn't, like right now I haven't considered adding in some kind of like object category or some other biasing information that would help the translation model do that, and that like adding say object category maybe would be a good bias.
So I mean basically some way of guiding the translation model to say that, hey, you need to not only look at my demonstration, but also have some understanding of what is present in the other person's domain, at least like one,
I see.
At least one frame of the other person's domain or something.
Okay. Yeah.
Can I, so can you actually go to, there's some like diagram that kind of look like this, where like it, I mean, my understanding is, not this one, there's like variables and stuff, but anyway, I guess my impression was that you were actually just translating at the abstract level.
Yes.
And then now you have this policy that actually executes in the new domain. That policy can take as input potentially like the observations.
Yeah, but this ZES to T, this is sort of assuming that if you saw me pick a bottle and you want to pick, maybe there's a cup in front of you, maybe there's another bottle in front of you, the exact same ZS to T would let you pick the cup and the bottle, right? Which I'm not sure.
Right, it's just a abstract file picking. It's just an abstraction of picking or something. Like in some sense.
I see. So then it's a very powerful abstraction which lets you do the same action on any object in your domain.
So
okay, I see.
I think one of the assumptions that I am making so far in considering a single object case is that I know which object I want to interact with and can ignore other objects. And I think for now I'm okay with assuming a slightly more general version of that assumption, in that I know which objects I want to interact with in domain 1 and have similar knowledge in domain 2 and have like correspondence between those objects as well, which is like limiting, but I think that's probably where I would start. Does that answer?
And I guess last slightly open-ended question, maybe channeling Chris, is given this work, what all maybe results or demonstrations do you think this would enable you to have on, let's say, real robots? What all assumptions would you have to make to make things work there, etc.? And is there some plan in your proposal to show some of this on robots?
Yeah, so I think the main conceptual result is this idea of translating a demonstration that doesn't exist on the target domain. And so the setting that I'm imagining is your target robot is capable of all of the skills that your source agent demonstrates. So you've observed all of those skills in the demonstration that you have in your target domain. You just need to compose them in a new set of ways that you haven't seen in the target domain. And that's because of, like, I think the problem of learning a new skill is another kind of worms that I'm not trying to open. But so let's say an example of that is if you have stacked a block on top of another block during training or on the target domain, and you're given a demonstration that stacks blocks in a different configuration. That's like a good, like, I think a reasonable goal to get. Maybe a reach goal would be, let's say you're trying to arrange some blocks on a table and you've done this by picking and placing them in the target domain. I think a really cool reach goal would be learning a strategy on the robot that doesn't use picking and placing them, but uses some other skill that has the same effect. So just maybe pushing them over with the elbow or something. So that would be a really cool reach goal that I'm very sure if it's possible. Yeah. So thanks. Yep.
Cool. Yeah. Nice talk. So yeah, some kind of similar-ish questions. So for one of your previous work, you have the Robo Suite data set, right? With like the I forget what it's called. It's like putting the loop on the peg task. Yeah. Do you evaluate success rate on that task? Or
so far, no, not in the context of the proposed work. So I think that is something already.
Or in the past work, did you?
Yeah, we have. I haven't measured task success rate as such. I have like evaluations on the reward values that you attain, from which you can.
Oh, you do. Yeah. Okay, you just didn't show them.
Yeah, I didn't. Yeah, I didn't.
Okay, but so like I guess for the future work also, you're planning to show actually like task success numbers and
stuff
like that. Okay.
Yeah. Cool. I mean, I have slides on that if you'd like to see it, but here.
That's okay. Yeah, as long as you're going to do that. I didn't see that in this talk, so I wasn't sure whether that was something that you were planning to do. So.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
Okay. Cool. Let's see. So I guess another question. So yeah, in the reconstruction, maybe this is similar to Shuam's question. You like the you bring up like the Robo Suite like visualization. It looked like the peg was in the same location. Are you also evaluating the peg in different locations, or?
Right now, no, but I think that's a good suggestion.
Okay. I mean, if it's reasoning about the interaction between the robot and the environment, then it should be able to generalize the new robot states and new environment states, right?
Right. I think the data set itself only has the peg location in one place, as far as I know. The like starting position of the data set.
Okay. So what variations are there actually in the task?
This data set has the starting position varies, the robot starting position varies.
So the what starting position?
The starting position of this little block.
Like before you pick it up?
Yeah, that varies. I think, I mean, I could make versions of these environments that change the position of the peg. There just wouldn't be demonstrations of it. But I think that it's perfectly valid to like test on that even then. And that's a good suggestion.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then on the right, are there variations?
There's 4 different objects that you need to place in 4 different like bins over here.
Right.
And yeah, so I think this instance of the robot Turk data set itself is not that like complicated. There's 6 tasks. There's placing this kind of a peg, there's placing a circular peg, there's placing these 4 different objects.
Yeah.
There's a later edition of this data set that has more interesting tasks like assembling a tool. There's a real world version of this data set that I think would also be interesting to use if I can figure out state estimation of the object.
Cool. Yeah, I guess it would just be cool to show that like if you don't have the interaction abstraction, then you can't generalize to new environment locations, but if you do, then you can, or something along those lines.
Yeah, I see what you mean. That's a good idea.
Cool. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think maybe, oh, and then, so are you still planning to use skill sequences as a cue or not any going forward?
I think it is still a good signal to use, but it's not going to add any additional information beyond what we already did in the translating robot skills work.
Okay.
So here, I think learning based on matching sequences of skills or sequences of abstractions would give you the exact same results as before, but not anything better than that. And like, I think in order to get better than that, you have to do things like keep track of environment effect or,
right.
Yeah, there's like, also, I think some of the adversarial training stuff that we proposed is stuff that we tried in the context of skills, but that didn't work for like a very specific reason. But I think these approaches will also work. And so a collection of these approaches might end up being better than the sequence matching from before.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm good.
Okay. All right. So, my question is related to Shivam's and Chris's question. So, so what you're doing is at a very high level abstraction. So, like the example that you used throughout is cooking, and your goal is not to learn how that chef like grasps a cup in exact fashion, but you just want to have the idea at a higher level, like recipe level. So since your goal is at that high level, if you're successful, let's say it's all learned, but you will have to kind of team up with another like person or like very nice environment where the agent can actually practice that skill to master the task. So without that, I don't think you will be able to like, use the real robot to show the effect, but it would be really nice.
Right.
So I think it's something that you could try, including, but only if you feel comfortable.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. The especially when you're including object-based skills, having the robot practice those skills after it learns them from demonstrations would be a good way to make sure it can actually execute them. And like these abstractions, the better your robot is able to execute each of those skills, like the better your like reasoning over the abstractions works. So I think the suggestion makes sense.
Okay. And then the question is, since you're learning the high level, like instruction level, what if something goes wrong and then you're in a wrong state? So you can recover like just following this these steps. And so is it part of your work or is it somebody else?
I don't think so there's different categories of that. There's if you enter states that that are irreversible or that you cannot recover from without external help. I don't think my work addresses that part of the problem. The other component is like, let's say I end up in a new sequence or a new like state that I haven't been to where I've stacked blocks wrongly and I need to adapt from there. Most of the work so far has been translating a task strategy that the demonstrator observed perfectly. So we're sort of assuming that there aren't errors in that, which is a good point and is something that like I'm going to need to figure out how we can replan from states once the transfer strategy fails.
So something like in the flat approaches, if you are in the wrong state, you will still try to reach your final goal. So there is a kind of improvisation, like plan. And do you support that kind of flexibility?
So I think this kind of improvisation at the low level is still feasible within the scope of our approach, in that the low level policy is still being run for several time steps before it hands control back to the high level controller. The other way you can afford this kind of improvisation to the system is to do this at the high level and say, I'm going to allow for the robot to execute additional skills beyond what the transfer strategy does. And that's not something I've like figured out yet, but like I think the sequence matching approach, for example, would fail in that sense because it doesn't allow for that kind of flexibility. Yeah, I'd need to think about like how I can enable that kind of adaptability at the high level and like letting you choose more skills to execute if you need to than what the demonstrator did. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that was my question. Okay, so does the committee members have any other question, Amy? Okay, then we can... Oh, Amy, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I actually have kind of like another like more detailed technical question on the option side. So earlier in your talk, you'd also, you know, I think there had been a question about, you know, what kind of options will get learned with the objective where you had kind of split up this like high level versus low level policy and dynamics.
Yep.
And you had mentioned that like one way to prevent collapse of those options was to specify like a particular sequence length for those options. Is that something that you've already tried? Like, were you able to achieve options that had some sort of higher level semantic and like interpretable meaning? Or do you think that, like, was that enough? Or do you think that there are other types of additional priors or objectives that you can incorporate to learn better options?
That is something we tried and do use. So there's a prior over how long a skill is executed for. So we tried two versions of this, one where that's fixed and one where it's a prior over, say, 10 to 20 time steps. And without either of those constraints, learning would collapse and we'd end up with, like I said, either the skills, the entire trajectory being one skill or each time step in the trajectory being its own skill. Yeah, so that is something we tried. I think there are other priors that you can definitely use. One of the things you can imagine doing is, so there's lots of versions of this. If you have a prior over the number of skills that you want to learn, you can have a prior over, say, 10 different points in your latent space and say that you want skills to belong to each of those clusters. If you have semantic priors, you can put constraints on what parts of the trajectory should go to what parts of the space. I think there's also like translation-based priors where you can say, I'm going to learn a space that's similar to the source space. Or similar to the skills that I saw on the demonstrator side. Yeah, there are a lot of priors there. I think for now, I'm sort of treating the skill space as something that's fixed and that I'm reasonably happy with. But I think down the line, it would be interesting to like explore some of those other priors.
I see. So in the scope of your work, interpretability of options is not needed.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I think I've on the trade-off between interpretability versus how end-to-end this approach is, I've definitely moved towards the end-to-endness of it. But I think you could add more priors of like say semantic categories of skills and move it closer towards the interpretability. I think if you wanted pure interpretability, a discrete skill representation is probably the way to go. But yeah. Sorry
to needle on this. I'm just gonna one more follow-up question, which is so So you think that there is a dichotomy between interpretability and end-to-end learning? You're like, you think that those are not two things that you can achieve at the same time?
Interesting. Okay, I'm going to answer this in the context of my work, where this continuous space of skills has been, or is arguably less interpretable than a discrete version of skills, and to me that there is that dichotomy in this context. In general, I've always had like an implicit thought that symbolic things and like are more interpretable than completely end-to-end systems. But if you think otherwise, I'm happy to like discuss that, or if you have like thoughts on why interpretability and the end-to-endness of things can be achieved together, I'd like to hear that.
I think that's something we can definitely discuss more offline. But yeah, no, great job and great presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Awesome, thank you.
Any more questions from the committee?
Okay.
Any other questions from the audience? No? Okay, then.
Awesome, thank you.
Do you have a private discussions?
Oops. I'm gonna leave my laptop here.
Yeah, leave it on and
Take
take it right now, except any.
Yeah. Oops. No, can everyone not on the committee leave the Zoom meeting, please? Okay.
We can pick them out, that's all.
Or put Amy in the breakout room, that's the other option.
Okay, I think.
I mean, or we can pick them out. There are too many.
Yeah, put it in waiting room or.
Okay.
But don't record that.
Okay, I see.
Tell anything.
Okay. Gotta be careful with that. Okay, Amy, I'm gonna hand you over to the committee. I'll be outside.
Okay.
Why is your video?
Did you stop recording?
Is this you?
Could you just stop recording?
Oh, yeah.
It's from Owl. Okay, yeah. Cool. I got it. We're good.
Okay. I just need to stop recording.
Oh, stop recording.
Yeah.
Oh, you're right. I didn't do that.
Stop recording.